So first of all, in order to really get the thought process down, we're going to go look at those two words in this parasha. Okay. So let's start there. We will go back into Genesis chapter 47, and we will go to verse 28. And we'll go into the interlinear. Okay. And I'm going to really quick screenshot this so that I can zoom in. Here is the word Vayechi. Vayechi. The name of this parasha, Vayechi. Okay. Now, and that's this right here. But when we go into the actual lexical root, or at least the usage of it here, it says to live, right? To live. Now, there are those, just real quick, there are those who get caught up in the expiration of a human being as being death, and the non-expiration of a human being as being life, because we see people being removed from life or being unalived in Scripture. And it'll say that they were killed or they were put to death. Okay? All right. Now, what we're going to do then is we're going to take a look at this, because there are what you could see here, there are actually two roots. Okay? There's actually two roots. The one root is chava, right? To tell or declare. That's one of the roots. The second root is chaya, to live. Okay? Now, we can obviously see that we're going to have to do some board work here, because we can see this is a child root, right? It contains a yod and a hey. So we have to go investigate. We have to learn. So going back to this verse really quick, I want you to see Jacob lived. Now, it does say Jacob lived for 17 years, right? But we're concentrating on this very specific anomaly. Jacob lived. Okay, so going back into the Hebrew, going here, you could see that this is third person masculine, okay, singular. So this is he lived, okay? He lived. The vav is the word and. It's a conjunctive, okay? It joins. But the other thing that I want you to notice is that it is in the sequential imperfect. In Hebrew grammar, you have a completed action or an incomplete action. You have the perfect and imperfect. There's not a whole lot of other types of verbal nuances in the tenses, I mean. The reason why this is important is because as we look at the grammar of this, you'll see it's in the past tense, and he lived. But what it actually says in the Hebrew is he will live. But the vav reverses time. So the vav switches it from he will live to and he lived. Okay? All right. So going back into our text, you could see that that is why it's not spelled like that. in the Hebrew. Okay. However, the root is spelled correctly. So we, of course, are going to go and we're going to look into the lexicon and we'll put in our Strong's Concordance number for the word he lived. Okay. And you see that there's our Strong's Concordance number, 2421. We'll double check that. 2421. Okay. Strong's Concordance number 2421. And that is actually the word living. But I want you to see this. Okay. Let's change the color here to yellow. As keeping the stomach fed. Okay. I want you to remember Jacob's vow. If you would give me food. Okay. You see, in ancient Hebrew understanding, a full belly meant you were alive. Let me show you. To be alive and continue alive, have life within, the revival of life gained from food or other necessities. Okay. So I want to, and we're going to we'll look at the parent root, but I want you to already see life in the heart of a Hebrew had nothing to do with the non-expiration, but instead in the material connection to what that produced. Food, clothing, shelter, gave life. Okay. Now, looking back to our text, to be alive and continue alive, have life within, the revival of life gained from food or other necessity. Now, going into the parent root. Right here is the parent root. Notice it is chet yod. We'll get to that in a moment, because another thing I want you to notice is that the pictograph, the pictographic definition is missing. The concrete is stomach. Okay? The concrete is stomach. The action is to sustain. And of course, the abstract is life. So, let's take a moment to let's take a look at the board here. And let's work with this a little bit. So we have chai, right? Chai. And it is pronounced chai, that being this being the Bach ending, right? But this is actually what? This is the tent wall, which is this symbol on the ancient pottery, right? And this symbol, which is what? The hand of a man doing an action. Okay? So now on this side, we have what? We have tent wall. And on this side, we have hand or arm. Okay. This has the concrete meaning, like when they identified with things, they would say tent wall equates to tent wall equates to separate. Okay. And this equates to a work or do. In fact, we'll put a /do here. For them, it was one and the same, but our Western minds need that slash. Okay. Now, having said all that, what I want to do is illustrate a little bit what I'm talking about. Okay. So in this premise, we'll take the tent wall, but what we'll do is we'll create the tent here. Okay. Here's our tent. Our tent stakes, right? Now, there were 4 parts to a tent. The 2 sides, the back, and then the front was usually the door. And although it may not have been shaped like this, the premise is the same, that this right here was actually the wall that created a separation. Okay. Between the outside and the inside. And I want you to recall that the inside of the tent contained provision, protection, and it contained instruction. Okay. And so that instruction was obviously anytime that there was a throwing of the finger from the father. Now, we know that the outside, and so what we'll do, we'll just go ahead and contain this in the tent, as it were. But the outside contained shame, right? Shame, nakedness, and exposure. Okay, now there were reasons to go outside the tent in terms of doing an action for the sake of function, but if you were outside the tent and you weren't supposed to be outside the tent, it was shame, nakedness, and exposure. Okay, now now we can understand the level of this tent wall principle. But then it says it's the work of the tent wall, or the doing of the tent wall, or tent wall works, or tent wall does. So there's a few ways that we could look at this principle. On the one side, we have the idea of there being a provision, protection, and instruction is the work of the tent wall. On the other side, we could think that it is the shame, nakedness, and exposure that is the work of the tent wall. But the truth is that the work of the tent wall is only to separate. Separate from what? Well, it's interesting. But basically, the separation is actually something different than how we understand it. You see, when we think of death and life, we think of death being the opposite of life. But as I'm about to show you, that is far from true. And just because a body expires does not equate to death. And just because a body isn't unalive does not equate to life. Because in an ancient Hebrew understanding, and there's two ways we could look at this. We could look at this from the perspective of Stone Age, which unfortunately, I think there's actually some scientific evidence now that actually didn't exist. But that's another discussion. But let's say that we do that. Let's say that we just say that this was pure ignorance on their part, that they were looking at life wrong. And they were looking at death wrong. But you see, the problem is that in that process, we have a human being still being alive and not fitting the criteria of life. Do you get that? There is actually a principle that life, as we look at it, is actually nothing to do with death. And life, as we look at it, has nothing to do with the function of the body to maintain heat and energy and immunity. It's just not there. Their definition of life actually had to do with a full belly. And if their bellies were not full, then you didn't fit the criteria of life. So when Jacob is challenged with the famine that eventually ends him in Egypt with his son being his provider, there is an intriguing function here. That when Jacob is in the famine, he's not alive. He's not alive. Okay? So, I think that's a very important element here. Now, I want to read so there are two definitions usually in the ancient Hebrew lexicon on the Bible. The one side of the definition will be pictographic, but we see that is absolutely, definitely not available at this time. Okay? Pictograph is, that definition isn't there. The second definition is the ancient nomadic definition. So let's talk about the difference between those two really quick. The pictographic definition is a concrete description by combining two pictures together to make a statement about, to make a new word and to make a statement about the function of that word. And will always be descriptive, okay? Then on the other side, we have the cultural definition. Do you see that those two go hand in hand? We still actually had to look at the board and we still had to see chai. right? We still had to see chai. We still had to actually visualize what it meant, right? Okay. But the principle is that in that process, we're looking at chai much differently than we used to, because now it's a separation in the tent. I'm going to get to that part. Okay. So now let's take a look at this definition, this ancient Hebraic nomadic definition. And reading in the orange. When the stomach is empty, one is famished and weak, and when it is filled, one is revived. This organ is seen as the life, as the empty stomach is like death, but a revived stomach is life. Now, I want to actually change our thinking. We need to renew our minds to Abraham's understanding of life, to Jacob's understanding of life, to Torah's understanding of life. Because Torah's understanding of life is very different from your Western social democratic enlightened in the 1700s version of life. I know there's going to be some critics of this, but the truth is that if we think like Abraham, we'll have faith like Abraham, and he's the father of all who have faith. Okay? Now, as promised, I said that I would show you the function of I would show you the function of the wall. So here we have this tent wall, right? Now that tent wall is actually a separator. Now, the outside world, okay? The outside world has a function of the outside world has a function of this. However, those who are in shame and naked and are exposed need to be brought in to the tent. Now, there's a function of survival in the nomadic understanding. Couple things that are important is obviously when we're working with this, we need to think in terms of how desolate the wilderness is. Okay, we're not dealing with a humid environment. We're not dealing with a plush environment. We're not dealing with a green environment. And so from that perspective, the philosophy would then function no matter what environment you're in, because the philosophy is this: if you're outside the tent, you're hungry. If you're outside the tent, you're hungry. And so the premise is as that you have to go outside the tent to get the shameful, the naked ones, the ones who have been exposed, and bring them into the tent so that they would have provision, protection, and instruction. Now, when I'm saying this, one of the more important parts to this concept is going to be that means you have to go outside the tent to get them, which means you're rescuing them, which is an action of the Yeshua principle. When you Yeshua somebody, you save them from what? From calamity or from death. Okay. Now that we have that understanding, let's take a look at death. But you see now that the word death itself, actually, you haven't seen it yet, but you see now that the word life itself is not necessarily the non-expiration of the body. You can be hungry and be dead, according to an ancient Hebrew. You can be alive and be full. Here's a crazy one. You could die with a full belly, right? You could expire with a full belly. That's not death. That's going down to your grave in shalom, right? Okay. Now, let's deal with this word death, okay? So I think the best way to do that is to use the same words that are in the parasha. So the next place where the parasha speaks of Jacob's death, that is where we're going to go next, okay? Now, I think it's important that we might encounter the possibility that Jacob's death actually, Jacob's death might be mentioned idiomatically and the word death may not be here. But let's go see, okay? So we're in Genesis 49:33, and we're going to go down to, see, he was gathered to his people. And so the best way for us to deal with the word death in this situation is to go to its first usage. So the question is, where was the word death first used? Well, intriguingly enough, it was used in the Garden of Eden. The word death was actually first mentioned in the Garden of Eden. And very specifically, it is in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. We have, except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die. Let's go in and let's take a look at that word there. There's a lot of ways that we could look at this after what we've just learned about life, but I also want you to notice that death is not necessarily the opposite of life. I'm about to prove that to you. Okay? So let's go into the actual Hebrew here, and we will go to the lexicon. We're going to go to the lexicon. And going into the lexicon, putting the Strong's Concordance number into the search, we come up with mem tav as our actual lexical root. I'm sorry, not lexical root, parent root. Mem tav, right here. Okay. So here's our parent root. Okay. But what I want you to see is that the word man is the concrete here. So we probably need to look at the pictographic definition. And we will put this up on the board, but I want you to keep in mind what is actually being said here. The pictograph mem is a picture of water representing chaos. The tav is a picture of two cross sticks representing a mark or sign. Combine these mean chaos mark. Here's the actual nomadic definition of the word that we translate as death. The length of time that something exists and ends. Okay? So, and I want you to see, the action is actually to die. The abstract is death. Now, what are we encountering here? We're encountering cultural conflict. We are Western. What does that mean? That means that we operate off of Greek linear logic. We operate off of the scientific method and model, and we operate off of factual, non-subjective case study. However, that is not what Abraham would have been operating off of. That is not what Adam would have understood about this word. You see, the function of death is not the expiration of the body. The function of death is the beginning and end of an entire existence. What does that mean? In a lot of ways, technically speaking, we're kind of in a state of death. Okay? We're kind of in a state of death. Keep in mind the principle that chaos itself does not have order. It doesn't have limitations. It's not governed. It doesn't have any type of function. Remember, it is dysfunction. It doesn't actually have a purpose. It just exists as something that is without order. Okay? Now we put a mark in it and we say something exists. We've now created a limitation of a beginning and an end. We've created time. So part of the function of man is time. Okay? The time from chai to mut is very important, because in our minds, we think when it says, and he lived, that means that he actually didn't expire. But there were plenty of times that Jacob was dead. Now, if you need proof of this, listen to Paul. Paul says, I die daily. You ever wonder what that meant? Or Paul says, what? He says, when the commandment came, I died. Right? He says that we die as we go into the water, and when we come up out of the water, we are resurrected. Notice it says in Romans, he says, for where the Spirit is, there is life. Right? He says, for the deeds of the flesh are death, but the deeds of the Spirit are life and shalom and peace. So now that we've made an adjustment on the death and life, and I think we're still going to go ahead and we're going to put death on the board so that you can see the illustration. Okay? We'll go ahead and get a new page here. And so our word is our word is moots. Right? Moots. So one of the things right off the bat, obviously, that's not our parent root, right? So if we were to go into our parent root, then we would just have the mem tav, and we may as well just go ahead and put those in the pictographs. Okay. So now on the one side, we have mem being water. But what's interesting is that the word water, when it comes to the mem, actually holds the meaning of chaos. Okay. Now I know chaos is actually a Greek god, but the description of something being so completely out of order is an English word that we will go ahead and use to describe this. Okay. But the principle could be without order. Without order. Okay. And on the other side of this, we have the mark. So let me explain to you a little bit of what we've got going on here in terms of the actual pictographs, from what the usage of them is. Why does the X represent a mark? Well, that's because when you would go to a place like, for example, if you went to a land and in that land there was a spot that you wanted to place your tent, what you would do is you would drive 2 sticks in the ground and you would hang your banner on those sticks. And so that came to represent that if you happened upon those sticks, you understood that this area right here was taken, was staked, was claimed. So you had a choice. You could ignore that and go your way, or you could try and take that spot and then have to defend your position. Or you could enter into covenant with the one and maybe dwell beside them with your own banner. But the point is that the 2 sticks crossed represented the clan staking a claim. Now recall that the concrete for this is man. That should tell you something. In the function of man, we have the beginning and the end of existence, of a perceived existence. What does that mean? That means that we actually have someone seeing someone else live and die. But if we were to actually look at the premise of this, then we could look at it from the point of view of bearing witness to existence. Okay? So bearing witness to existence is the Hebrew word chava. And if we were to say that somebody bore witness to existence, but it instead was going to say they will bear witness to existence, then we actually have the name of God. Now, the reason why this is important is because now we can see that mankind, or man, is actually a witness to the existence of God, but also a witness to what would be defined as God. Because remember, Jacob takes the time to actually say, this is how you will be my God. But what I want you to think about is that the word death, remember, let me say this, let me repeat this. We are renewing our minds right now. We are untethering ourselves from the Western social, democratic, scientific, objective, factual system, and going back to the mindset of our father Abraham, who is the father of all who believe. Meaning what? We need to stop thinking of the word death in Scripture as having anything to do with the expiration of a human being. Now, there are those who are going to say, wait a minute, there's places that say that a person died. There's a place where it says moot, and it's the expiration of a human, only the other end of it. You see, the moment that their body expired, that part on the one side was put in place. You don't have a gravestone today that says such and such lived from this date hyphen and it's blank. Okay? So let me illustrate for you here. So the principle is that the whole idea behind death is actually all of this in between. And the whole idea behind life is the ebb and flow of prosperity. The ebb and flow. So this being normal standard points in time, this being full belly and this being empty belly, and for a Hebrew that was death. Not moot, but that was death. And this is life, but this is the actual Hebrew word for moot. So let's see if we can kind of tighten this up a little bit in terms of seasons, okay? So let's see, let's do this. Let's move that over there and let's do this. Let's go here and we will define this as moot. Okay? Moot. So, and then what we'll do then is we'll go in and we will we'll do this. Okay? And then this we will define as chai. Okay? Chai. And we'll put the Hebrew letters here. Chai. Okay? Okay. And then what we'll do is we'll say that this point is the opposite of chai. Okay. And this, of course, is chai as well. And so this would be what? What would this point, what would these points be? This is the sun on the just and the unjust. Right? That is simple, normal operation. So life is what gave Jacob the understanding of how God was going to be his God. He was going to do something different than this. So now I have a question. Was Jacob fed? Yes. Was it standard? Was his existence with Laban standard? No. Jacob accumulated wealth through the process of business dealings, but only the father brought the abundance. Right? So in that principle, then, the chai that came, the life, as it's translated in English, came from a supernatural enhancement of prosperity. It didn't matter how many times Laban changed it from striped to speckled to not. It didn't matter how many times Laban changed it. The father would alter the births of those animals. And so it's important to understand that when there's an anomaly, right, in Torah, when there's an anomaly where there's no parasha break, right, then we need to glean an understanding from that if there's no parasha break, then guess what? There's some sort of thing that the Father's trying to communicate, and it's simply this: I'm God. I did that. I gave Jacob chai. Now, granted, there's an ebb and flow in Jacob's life. There's ups and downs. And if we look at the cyclical model of it, right? If we go ahead and we go with this model, where basically what we have is a movement on the points of a circle, you'll find that as this cycle proceeds, there's an up and down. This is actually the function of a sine wave. Meaning what? There is a beginning, right? There's a beginning of everything. There is a maturation of everything. There is an entropy of everything. And there is a death of everything. You see the ebb and flow of Jacob's life, chai, not life in Western social democratic definition, but chai, the definition of life, of a full belly versus not a full belly, did not change the fact that Jacob set a standard and said, if I'm fed. And what I mean by that is there's proof even in Joseph's exile to Egypt, and I shouldn't say exile, when he was sold into slavery, there is a function of that. Now, what is this? What is this principle here? This is the promise of seed time and harvest, cold and heat. This is the promise that was made to the entire world. So this is still the sun shining on the just and the unjust, right? So it has to be something more. So, are you living your life right now? Maybe, maybe not. You might be dead, which explains why Yeshua could say, let the dead bury the dead, which, by the way, was not a dishonoring of the mother and father, as people might think. An analysis of that would find that he was actually in the second burial of his family, which would be putting the ossuary, putting the bones in the ossuary and putting the ossuary in the mausoleum. But I think a very important principle that is being understood in Scripture and not by us is the true meaning of life and death. Now the question arises, What does it mean that death and life are in the power of the tongue? We will save that for the Midrash. But I think it's important that when we're discussing these things later on, that we keep in mind how off we are. When it says Jacob lived, what was God doing there with Torah? What was the principle there with Torah? The principle there was the testimony, the bearing existence. Remember, Yahweh's name means will bear witness to existence, right? We will bear witness to his existence. How? Through our lives being a living Torah. That's what Paul called us. Living Torah scrolls. And so it's interesting. When your belly's full, it's a demonstration that he is God. But that has to be a supernatural enhancement, which means what? It has to be more than what everybody else is experiencing, because why? They call on other gods. They follow after a Western social democratic philosophy. So you need to understand your life will be unique. Your life has to be more than just the 9 to 5, paying taxes and being a good patriot. The limitations you encounter will be very big foes. The limitations you encounter will supernaturally be overcome, and that's the only way. Because why? Because he wants to say, and he lived. The Father wants to show the rest of the world Chai through you. And that's why Moshe says, behold, I set before you life and death, a blessing and a curse. Choose life that you might live. What is the function of curse in Deuteronomy 28? Go read it, and you will encounter lack and decrease. What is the function of the blessings in Deuteronomy 28? Abundance, and definitely what? Being elite, being superior. Not as a race, not as a function of intellect, but a demonstrative element of God's operation here in this earth, eliminating the realm of determinism, in the sense that if you do, I will do. This is what Jacob said to Yahweh. This is what Yahweh said to the people. A covenant never, ever has that you don't have to do anything. So those of you who go look at the new covenant and think that you don't have to do anything to be in function with the new covenant, you are mistaken. Because the Father is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And one of the actions of that will be a full belly. The rest of the time that you don't have a full belly, your life and death are still one linear process of time in this world of formation. But you need to understand that in that whole action, there is life and death. And it has nothing to do with the expiration of the body. It has nothing to do with becoming unalived, or it has nothing to do with the non-expiration of the body. You need to disassociate yourself, untether yourself from the Western social democratic model of thinking and philosophy and function. You are not, and I will repeat, a part of that culture and system. And until I see an actual, literal, Torah observant, theocratic government, I don't care who's in office. You are not part of that philosophy, that function, or that culture. And you need to understand that until such time as there is a theocratic process in which God is the head of that group, it is the realm of death and judgment and lack and decrease. There's no blessing over a world who operates in the sentiment of what? Of there is no God. There is no God will always equate to social injustice, and social injustice is forbidden by Torah. A violation of Torah will result in exile, in destruction, in damages, because why? The Father will pull back his protection from those elements who are in a constant state of trying to set back the process. Because until you overcome the setbacks, you are going to stay who you are. If you always done what you always do, you always get what you always got. There has to be a change, a renewing of the mind. You cannot think of life and death anymore when you read it in Scripture as having to do with the expiration of a human or the non-expiration of a human. You need to think of it in terms of fatness. You need to think of it in terms of a beginning and an end and everything in between, the hyphen, as it were. You see, that's why there's a disconnect here. Either people are just waiting to die so they can quote unquote go to heaven, because then they'll have everlasting life. Research that process, because remember what chai means, right? Or they're living in a situation where they're looking back at the damage that was done in their lives, or they're looking back at what they didn't have, or they're looking back at some other thing instead of looking at the hyphen, instead of looking at the in-between, because what he wants to do is say, and he lived. But that will be a supernatural enhancement, because if Jacob only had what the rest of the world has, then Jacob would not have been able to say chai. Because an empty belly equated to death, a full belly equated to life, and in between is the mundane. And now you understand why when you go into Shabbat, you eat a double portion. Why? Because you are actually stepping into life. You're stepping into a supernatural enhancement that's more than what the nations have, or it's not God. Because he definitely put the sun to shine and plants to grow and the function of natural order processes to move without interference. But if you want to see somebody who is a Shomer Torah be different, then there has to be an enhancement. That's the bottom line. Now we could get into all kinds of questions about, well, what about when it says that somebody died? Or what about when it says that somebody lived a certain amount of time, etc., etc.? Remember the parasha Chaye Sarah. This is the life of Sarah. You see, the best way I can put it to you is, if there's a testimony of life, there's a supernatural enhancement and proof that the intensification of all power in the universe is actually personally involved in the person's life. Shabbat Shalom.